Hey everyone, so today we are going to be discussing language identity and how the groups we belong to in society influence our language. Last week we spoke about regional dialects and the idea that our geographical location influences the way that we speak. We see things like Southern English and Midwestern English, Australian English and Indian English. These are different varieties of English that are based strictly on geographical location. We also see things like Australian English and Indian English, which are regional dialects, even though Australia and India are huge countries. It's a dialect nonetheless because Australians tend to speak like each other, but still different from Americans, even though we're all speaking English. Same thing with Indians, as in the country of India. They tend to speak similar English to each other, that's still different from the way Americans use English. So in this class, we're going to spend a lot of time looking at American English, even though English is spoken all over the world. However, many of the concepts we speak about in this class would be true of all languages. All languages have dialects, and some of them are geographical and some aren't. Another regional dialect we will look at in a few weeks is Appalachian English. So we'll put a pin in that and discuss it in a few weeks, but we are going to come back to that one. So we looked at regional dialects, but there's more to it than that. It's not just the concept that people who live next to each other are going to speak like each other, even though that alone makes sense. What we find is that there are actually people who speak similar to each other that do not even live near each other at all. So, for example, you could have a woman living in Texas, New York, California, Florida, and Nebraska, and all these women or men, despite not living in the same location, can have similar language patterns. So it's not just their geography that's influencing their language, it's something about their social roles as well. Their social role as a woman, for example, that is dictating the way they use language. So different social roles can influence the language that we use. So these social roles can include gender, but they can also include age, occupation, education, race and ethnicity, and social class, to name a few. Whenever we have a social role influencing our language, we call it sociolects. So last week we covered regional dialects. This week we're talking about sociolects. To give a couple example of those, Chicano English, which is a dialect of English that is influenced by Spanish. However, it's not the same as being bilingual and switching in a conversation between Spanish and English. Actually, most speakers of Chicano English don't actually speak Spanish, but the English variety is heavily influenced by the Spanish language. Then there's also African American English, which linguists call AAEV, African American English Variety, or English Vernacular. In folk linguistics, this is known as Ebonics. So, FYI, if you want examples of these dialects, you can easily go to YouTube and search the dialect by name and can see some quick mini lectures and examples on what these dialects sound like. Because I imagine you've heard these before, you just didn't know the name of it. So some sociolects, like the ones we have listed here, have official names and others don't. We may notice a group's similarity, but not have given it an official title. In this lecture, we're going to look specifically at upper class English as a sociolect. And we're going to look at this through the question of how does our social class, whether upper, middle, or lower class, influence the language that we use. So in 1972, William Labov did a super famous linguistic study about social class, and he was specifically looking at the pronunciation of the sound R in New York City among the different classes. You might recognize his name because you were looking at him last week in one of your dialect videos you watched. So he's really important in linguistics research, especially in regard to sociolect studies. And his study right here that we're going to talk about from the 1970s is cited over and over again in other literature. So he's really foundational to linguistic studies. So in this study, he was looking specifically at the pronunciation of R in words that have a final R, which is when the R sound comes at the end of the word, such as the examples on the screen: for, car, paper, here, and there. So I happen to pronounce a dialect where the R sound exists when I use those words, but there are some dialects where they may pronounce these words like ka, fo. So that different pronunciation still exists in our society depending on what dialect you speak. So Labov hypothesized that there was a difference in social class between those that kept the R and those that dropped the R. People in the higher class are going to pronounce the R, and people in the lower class are going to drop or omit the R. So why did he think that? Well, because at this point in our society in New York, pronouncing the R was seen as prestigious. If you pronounced the R, that was seen as an upper class move. Alternatively, not using the R was an indication that you likely belonged to a lower class, and this study has been replicated in New York many times since the 70s, and time again the same results occur because the case of the R still exists in New York society. Anyways, he tested this by going to 3 different department stores, Saks, Macy's, and Klein's. Klein's doesn't exist anymore, and I really don't know what to compare it to in our society. To some extent, maybe compare to Walmart, but I think that all of us shop at Walmart anymore, so I don't know if that's the best comparison, but maybe like a dollar store. But anyway, Klein's isn't open, but get the picture that Saks is the upper class store, Macy's is for the middle class, and Klein's is for the lower class. So what he wanted to do was elicit the R sound from people at these locations. So he would ask them a question that would require the person to respond with the words containing the final R sound. So FYI, for those who haven't been to New York, when you're building a building, you go up instead of out. So instead of these giant 1-floor Walmarts we have in Texas, in New York, a building would likely be 4 or more floors high. So for his study, Labov would find something he needed from these stores that he knew would be on the 4th floor. And he would ask these sales clerks where to find that one thing, such as where can I find men's clothing? And the clerk would respond saying 4th floor. Then Labov was really clever. He would always follow up with saying pardon me or excuse me to get the clerk to repeat it again, 4th floor. And he was really clever about getting the clerks to say 4th floor 2 times because first of all, it doubled his data. So when you say 4th floor, you've got 2 cases of the ending R there. And when you get them to repeat it, they're saying 4th floor again, which then gives him 4 instances of the final R as opposed to 2. So the second reason why this is really clever and why he wanted them to say it again is because usually when you speak to people and you catch them off guard with a question, they usually speak quickly and not very carefully when they're caught off guard. But when someone asks you again, excuse me, our instinct as the speaker is to then overcorrect and over-articulate ourselves more carefully, which is what these clerks would do when they had to repeat themselves. So another thing that's really important to know about this study is that Labov is asking the sales clerks and not the customers themselves. He's talking to the sales clerks with these questions. And the reason that's significant to this study is because if you're looking for upper class speech examples, like from Saks, the sales clerks themselves are not likely to actually be a member of that social class. These clerks were likely lower class or middle class salespeople working in the upper class environment. So let's look at the data. In Saks, the upper class store, we see from this graph right here a lot of R's being used compared to the middle class at Macy's and to the lower class at Klein's. Then looking at Macy's, we have a significant amount of less R use. So it's significantly different in the use of R versus our Saks upper class group. And then again in Klein's, the lower class store, it even drops significantly more than the middle class in using the R sound. Next, let's look at the different iterations between casual speech versus careful speech. So as I told you just a second ago, Labov would ask the sales clerks, where's the men's clothing? And they would say 4th floor. And he would say, pardon me, and they would say 4th floor, and they would repeat themselves. So in this graph, Labov demonstrates the difference in the use of the R sound at the end of the word when they were first answering the question versus when they were repeating themselves. And that's what the first red box is. And the second red box shows their use of R after repeating themselves. So looking at the careful pronunciation when they were repeating themselves, you see that when the clerk, was being careful about their speech and trying to be clearer because, they're thinking, oh, this guy didn't understand me. Let me repeat this more carefully. There wasn't really a change between casual and careful speech in the upper class group, but there were in the other two groups. So we're talking about Macy's and Klein's, the middle class and the lower class. There's a jump in using that R sound in the corrected speech. So of course, the biggest jump is actually in the middle class. When they were asked to repeat themselves, they would insert the R sound. They were more likely to insert the R sound than the lower class clerks. And Labov thought this was very interesting and got the idea that the middle class speakers were more concerned about how they communicated and how they were perceived as speakers, which is why he thinks they had the biggest jump in using the R when repeating themselves. So what we saw from his study is that there was indeed a class difference in using the ending R sound. So it supported Labov's original hypothesis. We also saw that the clerks from Macy's, the middle class store, were more likely to use the R sound when having to repeat themselves. So what's really interesting about this is that social class is indeed encoded in our language, and yet these individuals, these sales clerks, were not necessarily themselves members of those classes, but they were simply in the lower, middle, or upper class context. The context being the department stores they were working in. So it's not like they were thinking, I'm middle class, I'm going to speak a certain way, but more so they were either in the middle or upper class environment and naturally accommodated the way they spoke so they could be perceived to be from that certain class. So the people working at Saks use the R in order to be perceived as being part of the upper class community, when in reality they may not have used the R at all in their home environment or outside of work. Whereas in the lower class stores, Klein's, the clerks didn't feel the need to accommodate by including the R, even after correcting themselves, because there was no need to be perceived as belonging to a different class, as belonging to upper or middle class in that environment. So again, the main message here is that people accommodate their speech to give a perception that they belong to a certain social class. So this is where it gets tricky. In Labov's study in the 1970s, it demonstrates that using the R was prestigious and dropping the R was not. However, we're going back to the 1940s now. In the 1940s, 30 years prior, it was the exact opposite. If you wanted to sound prestigious, you would drop your R's. Pronouncing the R made you sound lower class at that time. And how we can see this is in this video with FDR, former president. And if you look at this video, you can hear him drop the R throughout this video multiple times. We talked about context, right? If there was ever a prestigious context in which you would alter your speech, it would be being the President of the United States addressing Congress. And yet you hear him dropping the R over and over again in this historical announcement about this historical point in our history. It's significant because it tells us that something changed between the 40s and the 70s, and that the use of the ending R sound has continued to move on this pendulum of being back and forth, of being prestigious and not prestigious. And this has changed several times in our history of American English. So the question is, why and how did that work? Why is this changing? Why would one be better in one era and worse in another? So we're going to table that question for now, but it is a question we're going to ask ourselves again. You can watch this clip in Canvas. It's provided below this lecture. But let's come back again to social class and its influence on language, the topic of sociolects. We see this all around us, like the McDonald's slogan, I'm loving it. Even in large corporations or large corporate marketing settings, they're asking themselves, what is the demographic of our consumers, of our customers, and how do we reach them? So let's look closer at the difference between I'm loving it and I'm loving it. So similar with the R sound that we just looked at with Labov, the ing words, so ing words, are kind of class encoded in the same way. So let's look at the options we have. Singing, walking, running, and then alternatively, singing, walking, running. So this study is from 2004 and it addresses the ing conundrum. And what we find is that in different social classes, here on this graph, by the way, when they're talking about social classes, they have lower class, like working lower class, middle class, working middle class, etc. That's what those acronyms are at the bottom. And what you see is from this graph in this 2004 study is that in casual speech, the use of ing, so keeping the G sound or dropping it, such as walking versus walkin', again depends on the class level of the speaker. The ing from this study is found to be much more likely to be pronounced as you move towards upper middle class speakers as opposed to lower class speakers. So again, in summary from that study, we can see that the lower class is more likely to consistently drop the G sound, but that anyone speaking casually, so informally with a friend, they're likely to drop the G sound as well. It's just more consistent across all spectrums in the lower class where dropping the G sound is just considered casual English in general. An example of casual English, for example, when I text someone, I don't say I'm going to meet you at the movies. I'll say I'm gonna meet you at the movies because that's just more of a casual context. Something else interesting about studies like this when we're looking at marked speech, to put it simply, marked speech is when someone uses speech that is not considered standard or normal. For example, this is just one example. Marked speech is saying runnin' instead of running. So the interesting thing is that studies like this and others have shown that men are often more likely than women to use marked speech. In addition to that, young people are more likely to use marked speech than the older generations. So all of that combined, when you think about how McDonald's is targeting consumers with their slogan, I'm lovin' it, which has a contracted word, I'm, so instead of I am, they use I'm, and they also use lovin' instead of loving by dropping the G. So you realize they're doing that because they're trying to target specific demographics. So people most likely who are budget conscious, like the youth. And from the last slide we looked at, the youth are more likely to use specific marked words like that. So McDonald's, like other companies, will use language that speaks to their target market, the market they're trying to reach. We find as individuals that we tend to trust people that are more like us, that speak like us. The exercise we did last week on pleasant and correct English, one of the things we spoke about was that we might identify correct English as being another place geographically than our own, but that we would identify our own communities as the ones using most pleasant versions of English. So with that said, we tend also to want to buy things from people that sound like us and talk like us. Language is a way to gain trust. So in marketing, they will want to sound like their target market, like their target demographics in order to try to sell to you. And I think that's what we're seeing with the McDonald's I'm loving it slogan. So let's wrap this up. We want to say this about linguistics research. When describing linguistics phenomenon, such as the using or dropping the R sound or the dropping the G sound, or to say that men are more likely than women to use marked speech, we as linguists are describing tendencies. Not to say everyone conforms to these tendencies. So it doesn't mean that females never drop their G's, because we tend to see men do it more, or to say that lower class people speak a certain way and are always going to speak a certain way. That's not what we're saying. We're just looking at big, broad tendencies of different social groups. These patterns, these tendencies are significant, but we have to point out that not every individual adheres to those tendencies. So despite seeing these tendencies, we know that no two individual speakers are exactly alike, because every speaker belongs to a unique set and combination of groups, all of which influence our language, some of which we allow to influence us more, and some of which we allow to have less influence on us. We also have a tendency to shift our language style between environments or between contexts, like we saw in Labov's study. So sociolects exist and they're worth studying, but we cannot forget what we call idiolects, which is the individual way that you talk. So everything about you, your history, your geography, your social roles, your personality, they all influence the way you use language. So I want to end on that note, but that concludes our lecture on sociolects. At the end of this week, you'll do an assignment to see if you match up with any of the tendencies in your age group or gender in terms of e-laughter. So have a good week. See you later.